Hey everyone, and welcome to Backseat Sports. I'm Josh, and that is Caleb. And guys, this is going to be a fun one today, man. We're talking about what the 2020 NFL Draft says about your Big Ten team. We're going to go into the 2020 NFL Draft, talk about what the draft and all its stock and everything else that goes into it means. But first of all, Caleb, what's going on? How you doing?
I'm doing great. Still quarantine. We're crossing our fingers about the 2020 football season. Like the fact that the Big Ten says we can do it without the NCAA, so that's a big thumbs up. Still got the draft, which was a blast to watch. Felt normal and awesome. Watch a bunch of Big Ten players get drafted, and it was a good time.
Yeah, for real. So to all you Husker fans out there, of course, we will be back at it again with some Husker content soon. But we want to do some Big Ten content and do a little bit more of that this offseason as well. So we're excited to go through it. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's go. Yeah, overall, I think we wanted to really focus this draft on what players drafted means for teams, and overall a big picture conversation about how teams have been able to develop draft picks into the Big Ten and what it means for the Big Ten moving forward and the teams in the Big Ten moving forward with their draft picks and talent development, and how that translates to wins at the end of the day for programs. So there were 48 Big Ten players drafted in the NFL draft, of course. This video we're gonna be patting the backs of you Ohio State fans out there. 10 Ohio State players were drafted, 10 Michigan players were drafted, leading the way in the Big Ten. 5 from Penn State, 5 from Iowa, 5 from Minnesota, 4 from Wisconsin. The leaders in the Big Ten, of course.
Yeah, I mean, they had 3 first-round draft picks, which is a lot. They had 3 in the second and third rounds, and then 4 and 4 through 7. 10 draft picks, that's a lot, but tied with their rival over there, with Michigan, who also had 10 draft picks. Not as many first rounders or second or third rounders though. Yeah. But yeah, what you say, those first round picks, you had arguably the first 3, honestly. Joe Burrow went first, and then right. Chase Young, and then Okudah. All 3 of them had the Buckeye uni on at some point in time.
Yeah,
which is
insane.
Crazy. We saw firsthand Chase Young and Okudah this year. It was a lot of fun in Memorial Stadium on game day, wasn't it, Josh?
Really fun. Yeah, it was fantastic.
Chase Young,
so fun.
Chase Young destroyed our sad offensive line.
Yep, doing Martinez dirty.
Awesome.
Showed that highlight. They had to show that highlight during the NFL draft. They got to get a few Husker digs in there.
Their defense was impressive. And yeah, Michigan. I was actually surprised to see that Michigan also had 10 draft picks.
Yeah, they were
a lot of them in the later rounds,
flying off the board in rounds 4 through 7. Just Michigan player after Michigan player. My goodness, it was actually wild.
I think I'd be upset if I was a Michigan fan, to have 10
draft players picks drafted
and only win 9 games. I'd get the frustration.
That is rough. That's real rough.
Yeah. What's crazy is those 2 teams doubled up the next 3, which are tied third, which is Penn State, Iowa, and Minnesota. All of these guys with just 5 draft picks all won 10 games, but Michigan with 10 did not. So Penn State went 11-2, Iowa went 10-3, and Minnesota went 11-2. Iowa is actually the only team to have a first-round draft pick, though.
And that's where the frustration comes in for sure. I mean, we've seen over the past 3 years a correlation. It only makes sense. The best teams have the most players drafted in the NFL. Logically, that's how it would work. The best coaches are able to use that talent to win games. That's what's so shocking about some of these statistics when you look at some of these teams through the past 3 years who've had so many players drafted but haven't been able to translate it to the big time wins, or vice versa, haven't had a lot of players drafted but have been able to win a lot of games. And that's where I think the conversation gets really, really interesting with programs moving forward and the talent that they have.
I mean, it's no shock why Ohio State's competing on the national level every year, because they're pumping out draft picks like Alabama and Clemson. So yeah. It's not a shocker whatsoever. And then kind of every other team is scratching and clawing for that second spot.
I mean, over the past 3 years, Ohio State's had 26 total draft picks. Michigan's had 17, Penn State's had 17, and Wisconsin's at 13. So the West lacking a little bit behind. Wisconsin at 13, Iowa's at 12, and then there's a pretty big drop off in draft picks overall in the conference. The next highest is actually Minnesota at 6. So there's a pretty big time tier break when it comes to draft picks in the Big Ten overall. In the past 3 years, of course. We decided to track 3 years because it's just relevant to what's happening today in the conference and moving forward with teams. And we've been tracking recruiting as well and how that moves forward and translates into draft picks, which is a pretty interesting conversation we're going to have in a second here. You know, when you've got 26 draft picks and Ohio State's won over 90% of their games the past 3 years.
Yeah, and then Michigan and Penn State, you know, they each have the same amount of draft picks, but the win percent, Penn State wins 10% more of their games.
Yeah, they've won almost 80% of their games, whereas Michigan's only won 69%.
Yeah. Which is crazy. Yeah, that's 4 total games. And, you know, each of them play Ohio State, you know, all those years. So you can count, that's 3 of them. But, you know, Michigan has definitely lost to some of the worst teams by a lot.
In that same light, Iowa has 12 draft picks, but they've won 69% of their games as well. So
yeah, 5
Michigan
less.
and Iowa have won the same amount of games, but Michigan's actually produced 5 more draft picks over the past 3 years. It just shows the talent difference, yet the lack of wins. Of course, some people may contribute to the difference in conferences and scheduling, where we all know for a fact.
But I would say
Iowa
one thing
plays
about
a fluffy
that, even though Michigan has 5 more draft picks, the interesting is Iowa and Michigan have had the same amount of first-round draft picks in the last 3 years with 3. And actually, Iowa has had more second and third round draft picks with 4. So, you know, we think, you know, the first 3 round picks are probably going to be the biggest playmakers, you know, where 4 through 7.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, some of them will, but like most of the time in college, those big playmakers, and Iowa's actually had the same amount.
That is really interesting, because then when you go look at the recruiting numbers between like Michigan and Iowa, it's not even comparable. So maybe that's the argument with like Harbaugh. Like, if you're not able to turn 27 4-star recruits between 2014 and 2016 into draft picks versus Iowa, who only had 1 4-star in that same period, yet there's only a 5 draft pick difference, that is saying
and they actually have more picks in the first 3 rounds than Michigan does. Penn State also has more by a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's crazy. You know, Harbaugh took over Michigan in 2015. He's had time at this point. We've seen him move through that time, and so like he was dealt, you know, one of those years classes, and the others were his players, and so that is telling to the disappointing results of those recruiting classes have produced early on.
Wisconsin is 31-10. Penn State is 31-8. The only reason they have 2 more losses is because they went to Big Ten championships.
Yeah,
and, you know, closely lost to Ohio State. In those, they got blown out one of them, and
right,
whatever, it's Ohio State, you're going to get blown out. Every team's been blown out by Ohio State in these past 3 years. If you look at them, they have 0 first-round draft picks in the last 3 years. They're winning just as high a rate of the second best team in Penn State.
That's the conversation. I mean, like, you know, the fans of teams from the East are going to blame the bad schedule of the West, but realistically, when you look down the conference here, the only difference, which of course will give you, is Ohio State. When it comes to like teams winning and like teams production and winning games at the end of the day, Ohio State's the big X factor. Obviously, you have the recruiting advantage when it comes to Michigan and Penn State with how many 4-stars they're pulling in. Like over the last 4 years, Penn State's pulled in 25 4-stars versus Wisconsin 7, which is pretty rough. I mean, that's bad for Wisconsin. They're not good at recruiting.
But in the same
they never
way,
have been.
They've pushed them to the edge in the Big Ten championship.
Yeah,
you know, and they're winning games, and they win their bowl games too.
Yeah,
you know,
and like again, like Minnesota beat Penn State last year, and then Wisconsin smoked Minnesota.
What, Michigan hasn't been that dangerous. Like,
yeah, not overall, unless you're Nebraska, where we go to the slaughter.
Yeah, but Nebraska's just, if you just look at Nebraska, just talking to us, Nebraska is 13-23 in the last 3 years. We won 36% of our games. We're right down in the Maryland, Illinois tier.
Okay, I mean, again, with Nebraska, there are asterisks next to teams who are going through coaching changes. Like you look at, like, you know, Maryland, Rutgers.
Maryland's way worse. That's another just underachieving, which is crazy. But they have 8. They had 8 players go to the NFL. 2 in the last 3 years in the first 2 rounds.
Yeah.
Which the next best, you know, that's the same amount as Penn State.
Right. I mean, and you look at their recruiting. I mean, they pulled in a 5-star and 8 4-stars, which is better than Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, literally anyone else, basically, except for like us. But we didn't actually have those players. Like, we've had 10 4-stars, us as in Nebraska, the past 3 years. We've been working with 10 4-stars from the recruiting classes of 2014 and 2016. Realistically, we only had like 2 because
they left after the coaching changes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So our recruiting classes are skewed. So we're working with way less than what we originally had. Or, one gets caught with weed and then the dad pulls him from the campus.
It pulls him from the team. Yeah, thanks. But Maryland went through
round.
the whole situation too. So I mean, that's why the asterisks are there with Maryland. But I mean, they are pulling in the recruits. But like, I think Michigan State's the biggest disappointment overall when you look at like the talent they've had on that team and the records they've been putting out, which is the reason why D'Antonio probably got let go.
Yeah, I mean, they're right there with Minnesota in the last 3 years. They've had less draft picks than Minnesota. I mean, yeah, you think about all the great stuff they did in the mid, 2010s, but in the last 3 years, it's been rough for them. They're only winning 61% of their games. Lewarke was their quarterback. That's tough.
That holds you back,
Yeah, they probably had the worst quarterback in the whole Big Ten.
I mean, they had the worst offense, basically. I mean, for at least 2 of those years.
Oh, that's not true. We got Northwestern.
Well, true.
They went 10-3, 9-5, and then went 3-9 this year.
Overall, it only makes sense when you look at the numbers and like look at the talent. Why Ohio State's smoking everyone. I mean,
although like with this year's recruiting class, them getting dropped to 14th, we'll see. Even after going to the college football playoff, we'll see what happens. Urban Meyer is the quarterback, all-seeing eye. He's gotten everybody right. From Tim Tebow, Cam Newton, Alex Smith, Dwayne Haskins, Justin Fields now, Joe Burrow.
Oh yeah, he's been the quarterback whisperer.
And
right?
It's not like all those, and it's not like every single one of those guys too was the top quarterback. Like those years.
Yeah, of course not. Like, we mean like recruiting wise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So he's been able to nitpick like the perfect people for his system. Yeah. And then develop them over time, which has been insane. Absolutely wild with how successful he's been with the quarterback room at Ohio State versus like every other team in the conference. With how much
Cardale
success.
Jones, their third string, was able to win a national championship.
Right. Like you said, their 2019 recruiting class, they only had 17 recruits, 3 5-stars, 9 4-stars, 5 3-stars. This is from 24/7 Sports, by the way. It might vary by 1 or 2 based off if you're going off Rivals or 24/7 or where it might be, or ESPN or something like that. But we're going off 24/7 for these stats. But it does matter over time, like where this talent's coming in. Like obviously, the talent influx. Sure, 24/7 Sports might not nail everybody perfectly, but Ohio State does benefit from like the benefit of the doubt mentality where, Ohio State
could have been a 3-star, but then they get
Ohio State's interested in them. Oh, now it's gonna be a 4-star.
Yeah, that's true too.
That does happen, but at the same time, that happens for basically any big time school. Like, Penn State's offering. Like we might want to go double check and see like if these guys are actually worthy of being a 4-star now. It happens for any big time school. USC, Texas, name the school. It happens for any of those big schools because that's who 24/7 Sports and Rivals are paying attention to. Those are all factors when it comes into how much talent's actually coming into these schools and like why we're gonna probably do a bigger video down the road on like how recruiting affects teams and whether or not recruiting, quote unquote, actually matters. And I think that'll be a really, really fun video when we talk about that overall. But I do want to transition kind of into how each team is able to turn their recruiting classes into draft picks. But those 2014 to 2016 draft classes, again, this isn't a massive sample size, but we wanted to keep it in a sample size that would still be relevant to the coaches that are there today. At least, some of the players that were recruited by those coaches are still there today. Hopefully predicting, or at least be relevant to the next few years of Big Ten football. So, for example, 34% of Ohio State's recruiting classes from 2014 to 2016 were drafted the last 3 years. That is absolutely insane.
You count, just go 1, 2, you're going to be drafted. 1, 2, you're going to be drafted. 1, 2, you'll be drafted. Like, that's crazy.
Like, for example, Nebraska, 4.48% of our recruiting classes were drafted the past 3 years.
Hey, man, it's been a tough 3 years.
We've
lost a lot of recruits.
Feel for us, man. We're a blue blood program.
We're blue bloods. Just don't look right now.
Just don't look at us.
Speaking of which, I'm just going to interject really quick. Just imagine you're Texas, right? You are Texas.
Yes. Texas sucks.
It is just a wellspring of great football players. Just imagine you're Texas, right? You should be owning the Big 12. You're Texas.
Yeah. And like you're pulling in good recruiting classes every single year. Like the recruiting's not the problem.
Only 21 players in the whole Big 12 were drafted last year. That's less than half.
Versus the Big Ten had 48. And in 2019, it was the same thing. The Big Ten had 40, and the Big 12 had 26. The SEC had 64 in 2019, and the SEC had 63 last year. So like The Big 12
the
is like,
SEC is literally tripling them up, and the Big 12 is doubling them
yeah,
up.
yeah.
They should never get a team in the college football playoff.
And how is Texas not dominating?
Yeah,
That's
they
the
should
real
be.
question.
I mean, you have so much recruits. They get good recruiting classes. So we just think we're down. We'll just kick the other blue blood that's down. Yeah.
Yeah,
See?
but at the same time, we do understand that college football isn't the NFL. Like, not all talent will technically transfer to the NFL, but at the same time, like, it's a pretty good tell of where you're at as a college football program and as a conference, and it definitely matters in the long term with pipeline talent year to year through the conferences and through the teams. So back to a team's abilities to develop talent with their recruiting classes. So Ohio State was at 34%, again for Nebraska, 4.48%. Iowa at 18, almost 19%. That's really good. Penn State, 24%. Michigan, 29%. Next highest would be Maryland at 14%. Wisconsin, 18%. If you really want to be a good team, you want to be above 15%, ideally, year over year.
Wisconsin's 18, Iowa's 18, Penn State's 24, 29, 34.
Yeah. So you really want to aim for that 15% mark. And if you're not going to be there, you're going to really, really struggle year in and year out to be an 8+, 9+ win team.
Like for Ohio State has a 9.21% of you being drafted in the first round. Like,
that is interesting because, I mean, first rounders, Ohio State has had 9.1% of their recruiting class be first round picks versus the next highest being Michigan at 5.2% basically. So,
and then Iowa.
Yeah, thanks to 2 tight ends and Tristan Wirfs.
And Wirfs. Yeah.
yeah. But hey, I mean, I guess I can't be hating. So tough. You hate to see it, but yeah, no, it really is wild. I mean, Ohio State's had 21.85% of all Big Ten draft picks. Next highest is Michigan at 14.3%, and Penn State and Michigan tied at 14.3% of all Big Ten draft picks the past 3 years. You know,
I think the biggest thing is, like, we look at that percentage of the players that are 4 or 5, the 4 or 5 stars. Like, only 1.5% of Iowa's players are 4 or 5 stars, but 18% are getting drafted. Or Wisconsin, only 9.8, but then 18% are getting drafted.
Yeah.
Like, that's crazy. Like, you look at Nebraska's numbers, like, we have 14% of ours are 4 or 5 stars.
Which
is
again,
higher
to be
than
fair,
Wisconsin.
is rigged because it's really not true.
That's true.
It's like 5%.
When we won in 95, that recruiting class, we were like ranked like 35th in the country, I think, at the time.
Yeah, we've always been about developing players and finding the gems, And
Nebraska,
in
Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa has to do that to be successful.
Well, and Wisconsin's been literally insane at it the past decade, basically.
Yeah, especially on the offensive line side and just getting running backs.
Yeah, absolutely outrageous. I mean,
and you feel bad for Michigan, like, again, because 50%, and then they're underachieving. Only 29% are getting drafted.
You're just not developing that talent into NFL players.
Yeah,
or you're misidentifying the 4 or 5 stars from the beginning, and you're recruiting the guys who aren't actually that talented. It's one of the two. Yeah, and there is going to be a little bit of skewedness because some guys are still there, some guys leave early.
Yeah, that's true.
There is some skewedness there with the best teams because of guys staying as 5th years versus guys leaving as a junior. Those are kind of where some of the variability could lie with only having 3 years of data. So you might be off by like 5% or so overall. But at the same time, like, it's still very, very jarring numbers. I truly think the biggest difference is the teams who are really good at creating draft picks who don't have the 4 and 5 stars, like Iowa and Wisconsin.
Yeah.
It's absolutely insane.
It's just really, it is.
Especially
impressive.
Iowa. I mean, and that's been like where Nebraska fans have been so pissed the past decade is where we're like, literally
we're getting better recruiting
Wisconsin every single year by a lot, by multiple 4 stars per year, and we literally can't beat them, which is why it's so frustrating and why we've sifted through Bo Pelini and Mike Riley, and now we're on Scott Frost. It's a pain, guys. All you Big Ten fans out there, it's painful. It hurts.
All you Big Ten fans that don't care because Nebraska's like
Garbo.
We're literally on the same level on percentage win as Illinois and
Purdue. Let's move into looking forward a little bit here. Now that we've kind of quantified some of those stats for the past and how those recruiting classes translate into draft picks and how draft picks are translated into wins.
How do these teams take a step up?
Well, yeah. So I mean, like, let's look at these years right now. So I mean, sitting on Ohio State currently 79% of their current roster is 4 and 5 star recruits.
That is dumb.
That is so dumb. And then everyone just praises Day like he's the next god on earth when he's literally handed a roster of 4 and 5 star recruits.
Yeah, just Urban Meyer's leftover blessings.
They have 29 fourth year and third year players who are 4 and 5 star recruits. 29. To put that into perspective, Iowa has 4, Minnesota has 2, Wisconsin has 8. Again, Nebraska has 16, but realistically we have like 9.
We have like 8 probably.
Yeah, like 8.
Wisconsin.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, every team loses a few 4 stars. Like naturally, it's going to happen. So realistically, probably everybody's 4 stars, or at least a few lower. Ohio State rocking 29. Michigan with 30 4-year or 3-year players who are 4 or 5 star recruits. And Penn State has 29 as well. So like those 3 teams are far and away more talented recruiting wise currently with their rosters than Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, us, Maryland, Michigan State. Michigan State only has 2. What a fall from grace. You look at that and you're like, wow, that's crazy. You know, I mean, there's no reason for why Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin should realistically be competing with Penn State, Michigan, or Ohio State. But year in and year out, we've seen them competing with them. And this year, we only expect Minnesota and Wisconsin to be really good. Iowa should be at least okay. I mean, 92% of Minnesota's roster is made up of 3 stars versus like Ohio State's 80% 4 stars. That's insane. For like,
but is
like
Ohio
Minnesota's
State going to be as
success
cool with Ryan Day in 3 years as it is with Urban Meyer?
Maybe not in like 3, maybe not in 2 years after they lose Justin Fields next year and a lot of their insane talent that is handed to him. Like obviously,
and you don't have like you don't have the best defensive player that we've seen in college football in the past 10 years.
But
all right, and here's a question: in 3 years from now, like when we do this aggregate again, like which teams? All right, what do you think? Who's going to be?
Well,
1,
Nebraska's
2, and
going to
3?
take the biggest leap. Let's be honest.
Oh, so true. Please be true. Please be true.
I mean, when you look at the numbers, we brought in 9 4 stars last year. Well, 7 4 stars in 2019 in Frost's second year. We brought in 9 this year in his third year. We brought in 6 in his first year. He had a really short recruiting span, and then we lost 3 of them already. So,
yeah.
You do hate to see that. But overall, Nebraska, out of any of these teams, is in the uptick when it comes to recruiting and talent coming in.
But will Frost be able to develop? Dumb.
Right. That's the real question. Yeah.
You know, and what about teams like, Minnesota, who is PJ Fleck going to get the boat rowing in 3 years, or Rutgers? Let's talk, Rutgers. Greg
Rutgers is interesting. I agree.
They got nowhere to go. What up?
In my opinion, Purdue's the most interesting. I mean, they brought in 4 4 stars last year, and they brought in 5 4 stars this year, which Purdue before that was basically not pulling in any 4 stars ever. So that's really interesting. Overall, as a whole, I think Purdue's probably the team to keep an eye on moving forward to potentially take a jump up. And we've seen them be successful even with their less quote-unquote talented roster that they inherited. So overall, I think Purdue's probably the team to watch to potentially take big steps forward. Ohio State falling down an 80% win percentage, and Penn State moves up to an 82%, 83% win percentage over the next 3 years.
What about Michigan? Do you think they're doomed? Do you think if Harbaugh gets a quarterback, do you think he's gonna win a Big Ten championship in 3 years?
Man, dude,
because it's pretty much either he's gonna win one in 3 years, or I think
he's fired.
Or the fans get pissed he's fired.
Yeah. Well, he has to at least get to one. He could get to one. I mean, again, once Justin Fields gone, once Fields is gone, then it's all.
It feels like the whole world is opened up on the Big Ten for sure.
I think we got enough for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the perspective with the recruiting and how draft picks relate to talent and how teams have been able to convert their recruiting classes into draft picks and win games based off how many pro players they've had on their teams overall. Hope that all made sense in the whole conversation, and hope it was a fun conversation to listen to.
My Rutgers fans, if you are out there, I need you to comment on this video. I'm just so
We've never had a Rutgers fan comment.
If you watch this video, if you see it and you watched it and you liked it, just comment below who is your favorite Big Ten team. Like, that'll be super fascinating to us. Always like, comment, favorite, subscribe. But as always, I'm Caleb. That's Josh. This has been Backseat Sports, and we'll see you next video.
See ya.